Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another Wellbeing Wednesday, where today we will be talking about the mind and body. Now, the mind and body are often talked about as if they're two totally separate things. But actually, in my experience as a mental health doctor, I find that the mind and the body are very much intertwined. Mental and physical health conditions are often connected. And when one gets worse, unfortunately, I often see the other gets worse too. We don't tend to give the same importance to mental health as it is to the body's physical health status. And hopefully in today's session, we'll be able to dispel some myths. Now, did you know that the average life expectancy for someone with a serious mental illness is about 20 years less than someone without? Or that 30% of people with a long-term physical health condition, like diabetes, arthritis, heart or kidney problems, also have a mental health condition? Or that nearly 50% of those with a mental illness will also have at least one long-term physical health condition running alongside. They're quite astonishing statistics. And for that reason, I'm really grateful and happy to welcome Dr Mustakim Khandaker, who's an acute medical and renal physician. And I'd love to get his insights on his own patient experiences on the mental health and physical health interface. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome, Dr Khandaker.
Walaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
So I guess, we heard some really interesting statistics there. And I was just really interested to hear from your perspective, when you see patients with long-term physical health conditions, do you see mental health problems alongside? And if so, what are the most commonest mental health conditions that you often see?
Thanks for your question. In my medical practice, the common conditions that I tend to come across are long-term conditions such as diabetes, heart disease, strokes, arthritis, and in particular chronic kidney disease, which is mainly what my specialty is. And most of the mental health conditions that I see in my patients tend to be things like anxiety, depression, adjustment disorders. But of course, there are a whole spectrum of other illnesses that can develop, or indeed, the patients can have pre-existing mental health conditions, as well as the physical health conditions, such as psychotic illnesses, bipolar disorder, personality disorders, which is challenging to look after both for their physical and mental health.
Thanks. I mean, you bring up some really good points that, yes, depression and anxiety, even without a physical health condition, are the most commonest mental health conditions we see. So it's not unsurprising to me that those are the most commonest things that we often see with those with concurrent physical health problems. But you do mention the fact that there are a whole array of mental health conditions out there, and it's really important that we don't just see the person as this one mental health label, such as someone with schizophrenia or someone with bipolar affective disorder. Actually, they can come with a number of other health conditions, and it's really important that we are aware of that. So, you did mention that you do see people with depression, anxiety, alongside their physical health condition. And I'm just wondering, why do they develop that? Is it just that they're so fed up of having their physical health problem, or are there other factors coming into play?
I think it's a lot more than simply being a bit depressed. Certainly thinking about my specialty, there are so many factors that contribute to patients' mental well-being. Quite often my patients are on dialysis, which involves them coming into hospital 3 times a week for about 4 hours, being hooked up to a machine that cleans the blood, which is life-saving treatment. They often have a whole host of medical conditions, a lot of which I've described before. And this means that the patients are very restricted in what they can do physically. They often feel tired after dialysis, and even on the day after, on non-dialysis days. This can impact their social life, even their mobility. them wanting to go out of their house. They're often very restricted in their diets. Because they are prone to getting very dangerous levels of salts in the blood, which they have to be on medications for. They have to be on very strict fluid restrictions, and are often on a lot of medications that are life-saving. All of this can certainly impact greatly on their mental health and well-being, as the patients can feel very restricted. I think it's also important to remember that there is a younger population out there as well who also have maybe slightly different mental health problems. So patients who have type 1 diabetes, for instance, who have to inject insulin, it might be a bit embarrassing for them when they're out with their friends, and it's very restricting for them to do everything that they would normally want to do. And particularly in this age of social media, they might be seeing that their friends who have seemingly normal lives on sort of Facebook and Twitter and things like that, and they might feel that they can't have the same kind of life. All of this can impact on their mental well-being. And of course, if people have pre-existing mental health conditions, often it can be made worse by their physical health conditions that they suffer with.
Some really interesting points you made there, and particularly that, when we think about long-term conditions, we might automatically jump and think the older population, but actually we do have a younger population who may be diagnosed with a physical health condition that is lifelong, and what the mental toll must be like for them. And it's not just the condition per se, but it's all the management, the restrictions on their life around that, which can greatly impact them. I'm just thinking about then, what about the other way around? If someone has unmet mental health needs or mental health problems that haven't really been addressed, do you see the consequence on their physical health outcomes? I'm thinking about the statistics that I talked about right at the beginning. It's quite astonishing to think that someone with a mental health problem could have a life expectancy 20 years less than someone who doesn't. So in your experience, what have you found?
Certainly, I've found that there are worse outcomes for patients who haven't had their mental health addressed. And often these outcomes can be tragic. As I mentioned before, a lot of my patients have to take a lot of tablets and run many restrictions with their diet and fluid intake as well. And also they have a lot of medical conditions, which means they have a lot of appointments that they have to go to into hospital with a GP, etc. And you can see that there are many healthcare professionals that are telling them about the consequences, especially in my specialty, for instance, them not taking the medications properly if the salts are too high, fluid restriction. All of these kind of things can be very difficult and burdensome on the patient, and you can find that the patients can disengage with the system and not attend hospital appointments, stop taking their tablets, and these kind of issues can be devastating at times. For example, I've seen patients who've lost kidney transplants because they've stopped taking their vital medications for them, and they've ended up back on dialysis. We know that patients with poor mental health tend to have worse diets anyway. They're more likely to smoke, they're more likely to drink alcohol, they're more likely to misuse substances as well. All of those things not only impact on their mental health, but can also make their physical health worse in themselves, but also making their chronic conditions worse if they suffer with chronic conditions. Often it can be a really like a cyclical pattern with the mental health and the physical health being affected together.
It certainly, in my experience as well, definitely seems that way. And I did kind of allude at the beginning that when one health need is not met, then it can affect the other, and it can be quite complex at times. I mean, I'm just wondering, for those people out there who may be watching this and thinking, or that's me, I recognize that's where I'm at, or they might have a loved one, a relative, a friend who's in that position where they're not kind of addressing their mental health and it's affecting their physical health and vice versa. So what kind of support is there out there to address both sides of things?
I think the good thing is, in the recent times, especially as we've seen with the ongoing COVID pandemic, there's certainly been increasing awareness about mental health in particular. And I can see that amongst healthcare professionals, patients themselves, in the media, in social media. You might have even seen some celebrities and sports stars that are talked often about these issues and bringing it to the light of the public. For example, Naomi Osaka recently, who's a famous tennis player. And I think with all of this, the government have certainly seen that this is an issue that needs to be addressed and taken seriously. And they're certainly putting more funds into supporting projects locally and at a national level as well. In terms of accessing support, patients always have a resource in their local GP who they can go to. There are many support groups online and via social media. There are very good peer support groups now as well, particularly with patients with long-term health conditions that are within the NHS and outside the NHS. But these are particularly helpful for patients suffering with chronic conditions, because they can meet with patients who are going through something similar. They can share their stories, experiences, and feed off each other really and help each other. There are health psychologists available within the NHS as well. And also remember, with chronic conditions as well, such as sort of heart failure, diabetes, they have specialist nurse practitioners who are dedicated for these patients, and they have not only a wealth of knowledge about the physical health conditions that the patients suffer, but also can appropriately direct the patients who are going through a hard time to the appropriate support. So I think it's great that there's lots of support out there for patients, and I think with more awareness, this is only going to get better. So it's hopefully good news in the future, inshallah.
Thank you for that. As someone who has always been interested in the mind and body interface, I found today really, really interesting and incredibly useful to know just exactly what are the problems on the ground that people may be facing if they do have physical health and mental health problems, but most importantly, that there is support out there in a variety of ways. I think it's also really important for us to remind those who may be going through some difficulties, don't feel afraid to ask for that help yourself. It might be that your GP or your physical health clinician may not necessarily pick up on the fact that you have some unmet mental health needs, or if you're under a psychiatrist, it might be that they haven't picked up that you have some unmet physical health needs. So don't be worried to be the driver of your own health outcomes, and ask for that help that you may need. It sounds like there's a lot out there that you can actually access. Dr. Khandaker, it was a really big pleasure to have you join us today and talk about a topic that's really, really important. I think particularly you mentioned about the pandemic, and I think every clinician has noticed that after the pandemic, it's not over, so to speak. There's lots and lots of unmet physical health, mental health needs, and it's really important that we've addressed some of those things today. Thank you very much. And for those of you who are watching, I hope it was beneficial. If you have any topics or wish to be a guest speaker yourself, please do get in contact with us, and we've linked my email address below. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.